Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Julia Joja. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
Giselle Donnelly. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and
Daniel Buruhaj, also with AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that tend to emerge along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Today, we have as our guest Paul Goble, who's a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. And I've been reading him for a long time, so I'm thrilled to have him join us. I can only recommend you read him too, particularly on Jamestown. His analyses are some of the deepest and most comprehensive. And I was reading him even when I was on the Eastern Front. So that says a lot. Paul, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll talk about Russia, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about the Caucasus overall, but I want to get us started with the aftermath of the terrorist attacks at the Crocus Concert Hall in the suburbs or near Moscow that took place a couple of weeks ago. We have seen at that moment and in the days after a lot of reactions within Russia and a lot of back and forth, including from Putin himself about who is to blame, and in classical Russian propaganda style, 5 or 6 alternative narratives. And of course, none of them are compatible. None of them really make sense. If we're blaming the Ukrainians, if we're blaming the West, I think at some point they tried to blame the UK and the United States. But now that the dust has settled a little bit, Paul, can you tell us what the aftermath has been in terms of the narratives, but also how it's being perceived in Russian public opinion, to the extent that we know how people are trying to frame this and how people are trying to process this now a couple of weeks later?
You pointed to the real problem. The Putin regime, in contrast to its predecessors, floods any event with a multitude of ideas, of suggestions of what's been happening. And on the one hand, that confuses the issue so that everyone dismisses everything. That's the first thing. The other, however, is they dismiss all of those things. The Russians not only dismiss any one of the theories, any one of the narratives, as you're calling them, but the whole notion that they're being told the truth at all. And that leads, on the one hand, to some conspiracy thinking among a probably limited number of people, although they're the most vocal, and also to an increasingly sullen, isolated, and appalled population that says nobody's telling us the truth. So I think it's further alienated the population and the regime. I think the far more important than the multiple narratives, however, was the Putin administration's proud display of its use of torture. That this is the very first time the Putin regime has used torture since at least 1999, but this was the first time that they put it center stage and made it very clear that they're doing it. There was no shame. There was no effort to suggest that this had been taken somehow independently of the Kremlin. And I think that probably is going to be the most important consequence inside Russia. I think the most important consequence more generally is what it means to Central Asia. The Central Asians are furious with the idea that torture could be used against them. They're very angry about the openly racist comments and behavior in the Russian Federation, with people trying to push the migrant workers out, many of them out, something that will hurt the Russian economy more, but will also have the effect of making Central Asians far more suspicious of any cooperation with Russia. I think that both China on the one hand and Turkey in the West on the other are going to pick up in Central Asia precisely as Russia loses. And I suspect a year from now, we'll be talking less about the open display of support for the use of torture and more about the way in which the Crocus events had the effect of separating Central Asia from Russia far more than hitherto. I've seen suggestions in some of the commentaries that what Russia has done, especially with regard to torture, but also with regard to pushing the Central Asians out of Russia, may drive the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan in the first instance, but the others as well, in the direction of the so-called former Soviet West, that is to say Moldova, and even the Baltic states. I don't think it will go that far immediately. But I do think that the real impact of Crocus is going to be Central Asians are going to move away from Moscow far more than they have before. And I think the real question is, does Turkey pick up the pieces? Or does China? There's enough racism in Kyrgyzstan to suggest China isn't going to win everywhere. The question is going to be, how is that going to play out? But Russia is not going to be the primary player that it has been up to now. It isn't going to be a choice between Russia and someone else. It's going to be a choice between two others. And that's going to be very, very difficult for many in Moscow to accept.
May I ask about kind of a third alternative in which Central Asian states sort of huddle together in a way that may not be a natural sort of a thing, but it's one of the things that's been notable to me over the last several years is how the Azeris in particular have somewhat distanced themselves, it seems to me, from Turkey. So you wonder if you're a Central Asian, can you trust anybody really, or is there kind of a habitual impulse to look to some outside power to stabilize and guarantee and et cetera, et cetera?
I think that there is greater movement in the direction of cooperation in Central Asia. It's certainly true. I think that's mostly been driven by the fact that Turkmenistan has entered the region. That if one had to look for a big story inside Central Asia in the last 3 years, it would be that suddenly we're not talking about Central Asia. As you know, most of the writing about Central Asia in the West has always said, well, this is about the four, not the five. Turkmenistan is prepared to cooperate with many more people. They don't have the baggage. They're more willing to move out. I don't personally believe that Turkey itself is going to be the big player. I think Turkey may work as a handmaiden to the West more generally. I suspect that the French, and to a lesser extent the Americans, are going to work with Turkey to expand influence. With respect to, I think that the Central Asians don't trust anybody. They've been mistreated. They've been neglected. I mean, we all know that it wasn't very long ago that people in the United States, for example, referred to the entire region as the stands, which was highly insulting, and people haven't forgotten that. But it's also true that the Central Asians are very aware that they really don't want a big friend right next door. They'd rather have friends farther afield. And my guess is that gives Turkey and the West options it didn't have 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that the Russian use of torture against Central Asians was so blatant that a lot of people there are rethinking what they're going to be about. As I say, I really think we'll remember Crocus as the turning point in Central Asian development more than in terms of its domestic consequences. I think that Putin made a very bad mistake, that he thought he could get away with torture because people were angry, much as unfortunately other leaders have in the event of a mass terrorist attack, but that by being so blatant about it, he appeared to send a signal to all the worst elements in Russian society that are prepared to engage in racist attacks on Central Asians. The Central Asians can see that. They blame the Kremlin overwhelmingly. They don't see, in the past, there was a sort of, in Central Asia, a good Tsar, bad boyar attitude about what happens in Russia. I think Putin, by flaunting that use of torture, has undercut that. And I think that gives other countries a chance. If I were focusing primarily on Central Asia these days, I would be spending 80% of my time looking at Ashgabat, because I think Ashgabat is going to be the big player. Kazakhstan, of course, is the largest country, Uzbekistan the most populous, and traditionally the dominant player. But I think that in the short and medium term, it's going to be the directions that Turkmenistan takes that's going to allow cooperation or not. And so we in the West have utterly failed to develop a cadre of Turkmen experts, and we're paying for that. I remember just how hard it was to convince people in the early 90s that we really needed to have people who knew Turkmen go to Turkmenistan rather than assuming everything could be done in Russian. And it was a harder sell, in my own experience anyway, than making that argument for those going to Tashkent or Astana. And I'm quite worried that what may happen in Turkmenistan will have such enormous consequences that we're going to be flying blind. I will tell you the Chinese aren't. The Chinese have a significant cadre of Turkmen language competent experts, and they're paying attention. They've been there, they've been on the ground, so that the Chinese will make fewer mistakes. But I think that precisely for the reason you talk about a cooperation across Central Asia, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz in particular aren't too thrilled with the idea of China replacing Russia as the hegemonic power.
I wonder if I could change the gears just a little bit. So on April 22nd, there was a conference held in Tbilisi under the title of Traditional Values as a Factor Connecting Countries and People. And it's widely suspected that this was orchestrated by the FSB, that it was a Russian influence operation. Nonetheless, there is a significant constituency in a country like Georgia for the narrative that, yes, perhaps the EU can make you wealthy, but you'll lose your immortal soul in the process, and it is only Mother Russia and the sort of embrace of the orthodoxy that can really provide for your innermost longings. In your assessment, how large a constituency there is in countries neighboring Russia for this kind of narrative, and is there kind of an equivalent of this that Russia would deploy in Muslim majority countries, in say Turkmenistan, that would sort of appeal to the same sort of socially conservative traditionalist instincts, depicting the West as decadent and, seeking to impose multiple genders and mixed sex bathrooms and all the rest of it on fundamentally conservative populations of the region?
I think it might be well to ask questions about how the Armenians see that. But to get to your specific question, I think there is in every country in this region a significant, not majority, but significant group of people who are all very much in favor of traditional values. That doesn't mean, however, that they see an alliance with Russia as a defense of those values. Instead, they see Russia trying to undermine their traditional values rather than seeing Russia as a support of traditional values. The situation is very, very different than what we see in the right wing in Western Europe and the United States, where somehow the fact that Russia says it's for traditional values is read as meaning it's lining up with the French right or the American right or somewhere else. In these countries, when you talk about traditional values, you're talking about our language, you're talking about our religion, you're talking about our histories, all of which, let's be very blunt, have been attacked by Russia for a very long time. And Russia isn't very credible as saying, we'll defend your value. If you could imagine a conference where the only question is, do you support traditional values? Period. The answer is a whole lot of people across this entire region and much of the world, to be blunt, would line up. If you ask the next question, who do you see out there who's going to support your traditional values? Then the answers are much more interesting and more complicated. And my guess is the Armenians certainly don't see the Russians defending their traditional values. A lot of Georgians are in the streets because they don't see Russia defending their traditional values, and they even see Russia, the people in the streets, as a threat to Georgian traditional values. Traditional values, because, let's be blunt, most people who study this part of the world are still Moscow-centric. They still live in Moscow. They still think of the world. And I've been saying for 35 years, you can cover Israel from Damascus, but it would be wrong. You can cover a lot of these places from Moscow, but it would be wrong. Unfortunately, that argument hasn't been accepted. And so the Russians set a vocabulary, a set of memes that get picked up. But what it means to be for traditional values, if you're sitting in Tashkent, and what it means to be for traditional values if you're in Moscow, are totally different things. And if you ask the person in Tashkent, do you think the people in Moscow are defending your traditional values? The answer is going to be no, even if that person in the domestic context of Uzbekistan says, I'm for traditional values. And I think that distinction needs to be made, and I don't think it often is, because in Moscow, the people around the government and in government-related media outlets assume that support for traditional values means you ally yourself with Russia. I think that works in Western Europe. I know it works in the United States, but it doesn't work in places that, shall we say, I have had a more immediate experience with what the Russians are about. I've spent a large part of my career working on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I know lots of people in those three countries who have views on traditional values which frighten Western liberals like myself. Having said that, I can promise you that not a single one of those people I know in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania thinks the Russians are a good defender of what it means to be for traditional values if you're an Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian. They see Russia as a threat to their traditional values. I believe, and I could document this given a few minutes, pulling stuff up, that in Central Asia, it's much the same. It's increasingly the same. And I also believe that the people who pushed for traditional values as the flag on which the Putin regime would march into a glorious future didn't think it out very far. They didn't think it all the way through. They didn't realize that if you start telling people you should love your history, you should love your language, you should love your religion, you should hate anybody who challenges those things. Okay, fine. That's about as good a nation building strategy for those countries as you can imagine. You invade Ukraine, I've said and I believe that the Ukrainians should put up two statues of Soviet and Russian leaders in their main square. The first is a statue to Stalin, who drew a Ukraine bigger than it probably otherwise would have been. And the second is to Vladimir Putin, who built the nation by invading it. I mean, what Russians say and what the West assumes on the basis of what Russians say just doesn't work in places like the Baltic countries, and I don't think it works in Central Asia. And I believe that the Central Asians are every bit as clever as the Balts in understanding what's going on. And if they're not, they're going to have it explained to them by other Central Asians. And here I would argue that the Turkmens and secondary, the Kazakhs, are taking the lead in explaining that. So, of course, there are lots of people in lots of countries who want traditional values in the way Americans and the Brits understand and the Europeans understand. And therefore, people assume being for traditional values means you're aligning yourself with Russia. That's fine if you're sitting in the United States and you've got 3,000 miles of water between you and them in most directions. It isn't fine if you've had the experience of a Russian government that feels that it can be proud of torturing your citizens. I just don't see that, and I think we've got to recognize that.
So in the vein of traditional values, we cannot move away from that yet. I want to ask you also about the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church specifically, that at least on paper, I would say on the ground too, in other countries, in Ukraine, in the Baltic countries, in Moldova, and you name it, has been through this full-scale invasion certainly losing ground. But on the other hand, they have been, and it's a phenomenon in itself, the Orthodox Church in Russia has been very active in the war. They've been blessing and throwing holy water on all the missiles and all the bombs that were intended to kill Ukrainians. The head of the church, Kirill, and others have been making statements about how this is a holy war. And so now, 2 years plus into the war, I have a difficult question for you to answer in just a few minutes. How is the Russian Orthodox Church doing? How do you evaluate it in terms of its impact inside of Russia and also in terms of its attraction and soft power abroad? Not too long ago, we had even prominent American intellectuals converting to Russian Orthodoxy. How are we doing now?
Okay, first, there's a huge distinction between the very top of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and Russian Orthodox Christians. In some people would say they have very little to do with each other. The top part of the church mostly consists of former KGB and now FSB officers, including the current patriarch, who has the rank of a general. They are totally loyal to the state. They get a lot of media attention. And then you have the Russian people who, while they turned to religion, it became fashionable in the 1990s after the fall of communism, are now almost as fast turning away from religion. The amount of participation in religious activities has declined. The influence of the church on Russians has declined. Yes, the upper reaches get a lot of attention, but inside Russia, the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church is lower today than it's been, in my mind, since, say, 1985. With respect to the former Soviet space, 3 formerly occupied occupied Baltic countries and the 11 others. I think it's fair comment that we're watching all of those places drift in the direction of autocephaly and a national church. We've just seen that the so-called Estonian Compromise, where you have two Orthodox hierarchies, begin to collapse and fragment. We've seen the move of the ecumenical patriarch in Lithuania, which probably sets the stage for that church coming apart. We've seen some really interesting moves of the Roman Catholic Church in Belarus, with the Pope having restored his title as Patriarch of the West, which has a whole lot to do with Belarus and a whole lot to do with what's going on in the western part of what was the Soviet Union. I think the Orthodox Patriarchate kicked the can down the road a little bit in Azerbaijan, but I think it's very likely that we'll see demands for autocephaly appear there too. And of course, Georgia and Armenia already have their own autocephalous Orthodox churches. So the Orthodox Church is not doing very well at all, except in the press releases put out by Kremlin media outlets. With respect to the question of Western intellectuals choosing to join Orthodoxy, most of those people, I think, come out of mainstream Protestant Christianity, which many people feel has lost its savor, and they're looking for a faith that, at least on paper, says it precisely what it believes. There's too much a sense, I think, among many Western mainstream Protestants that their churches no longer stand for anything. And a lot of people would like a church that stood for something, even if they were going to disagree with it. So I think some of what you're seeing is that. But I also think that the numbers involved turned out to be quite small, and they've become vanishingly small since February 2022, when Mr. Putin chose to launch his expanded invasion of Ukraine. But I really think we are watching the death of the Moscow Patriarchate as a supranational church, and it's on its way to being reduced to being a national church. And I think that it's one of the things I try to keep track of. I think we're seeing movements within Russia itself where we could see a fragmentation of the Moscow Patriarchate and the creation of multiple patriarchates in the future. Certainly, the current ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople is open to pushing that. And I think this will happen first in Siberia and the Far East, where there's a lot of unhappiness with the KGB style and background of Patriarch General Gunaev, as he is referred to in Siberian outlets. So again, if you read only the Russian media, and most of that now is under state control, you would think that the patriarch was going from strength to strength. If you read what's coming out in the Telegram channels of various church leaders around the country, if you read the people who've gone into emigration, some of them coming to this country, to the United States, some going elsewhere, what you see is a church that's falling apart. And if you look at the statistics of church attendance, of identification as Orthodox, attendance has never been this low since 91. Identification as Russian Orthodox has fallen significantly, and many people say they're Orthodox simply because they think that means we're Russians, that we should say that. But I don't think it means very much, especially since I think there are so few people who follow the regulations of the church. And I think we're going to see a weakening of Russian Orthodoxy domestically as well as in the neighboring countries.
Well, it's about time for Rod Dreher to have another crisis of faith. It couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Paul, this has been just a great conversation, and I hope we can get you back absolutely ASAP to talk some more about Central Asia. But I did want, the Eastern Front can be a very gloomy place. And before you go, I wanted to ask to take you back to the question of the public display of torture. There is a sense in which extreme sort of exhibitions of violence have been a feature, not always of the regime, but of the Ukrainian invasion. So, taking sledgehammers to prisoners' heads and so on and so forth. So tell us a bit about whether you think in a Russian context, there's a point to the violence, or if the violence itself is a point.
Well, I think two comments quickly. First, all of the actions of torture that happened up to this point were by subordinate people who could easily be disowned by the Kremlin. They weren't always, but people did talk occasionally about law and order and, playing by the rules and that sort of thing. And there were some cases brought against some of the worst examples, not all, but some. So those were very different. What Putin has done is not only tortured people in or authorized the torture, but defended it and flaunted it, which sends the wrong signal to the population. We're already seeing an upsurge of violence with the return of the criminals who went to fight in Ukraine. We're going to see more of it. And there's going to be a real upsurge of family violence, of husbands and wives beating and killing each other, which unfortunately the Duma has sanctioned effectively. So what I see is, while a lot of people say it's a terrorist incident, if it takes torture to find out what we need to get them, then you do it. There was a lot of feeling like that in the United States after 9/11. We just didn't have anybody under arrest that might have been fallen victim, but there would have been, unfortunately, support in some circles in this country, in the United States. But I think that we shouldn't write off Russian society as just waiting for violence, bloodthirsty. I think what this did is gave sanction to some of the worst elements in society, that the government was no longer going to oppose them, but would welcome that kind of activity. It certainly makes prosecuting jailers for mistreating people far more difficult and unlikely. It means that Russian law, Russian courts have been gutted in terms of their role as defenders of the Constitution and of the rights of the Russian people. So this is a very big change. And in Russia, inside Russia, I see that as the major effect of the Crocus events. As I said, the movement away of Central Asia from Russia, I think, is going to be geopolitically a vastly more important thing, because it's possible that there could have another incident of violence and torture, and the regime could finally do the right thing, that send a different signal. I mean, Putin isn't going to be accused of having a foolish consistency. He's quite prepared to move around in a variety of different directions. And I promise you that if there were a case of torture in Russia next week, and Putin said this person has to be brought to court, we could count on a large number of people in the United States and in the Western world general to inform us how wonderful that was, forgetting, of course, what was done a month earlier. I promise you. And if Putin sees an opening to do that, he will use it if he thinks that will work. If, however, he thinks that sending a message that violence will be tolerated, he's creating what I think could be a disaster, not only for Russia, but also a disaster for himself. There are 25 plus million guns in private hands in Russia now, about half of which are there illegally. So nobody knows exactly who's got them and what they can do. Sending a message that violence will be tolerated guarantees there will be more violence, and that sets up a vicious cycle of popular violence promoting regime violence, provoking popular violence. And it's not impossible to imagine that could spiral out of control, or alternatively, as I said, lead the people on top to say, oh my God, what have we done? We got to back away, especially when they know that people in the West have short memories and will celebrate whatever Putin does in the positive direction, forgetting all the bad things he's done otherwise.
That's a very wise note to end on. Paul Goble, thank you so much for joining us on the Eastern Front podcast, and by popular vote initiated by Giselle Donnelly. Please come back soon.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
From me, Julia Joja, and my friends,
Giselle Donnelly and
David Buruhaj.
thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, please give us a follow on Twitter or X at Eastern Front Pod, and sign up for a newsletter included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.